Of the 5 Ingalls children, Carrie was the one the family quietly braced to lose. The small one, the sickly one, the girl whose lungs never quite worked right, who suffered worse than any of them through the winter that nearly killed the whole town. The one whose name, even at the start, was a smaller version of someone else's. Caroline, shrunk down to Carrie to keep her from confusing with the mother she was named for. So here is the part the books never sit you down and tell you. Carrie outlived her father. She outlived her mother. She outlived Mary, the blind sister the entire family had spent decades organising itself around. She outlived Grace, the baby. She outlived her own husband. She outlived her stepson. The one nobody expected to survive became the one who buried them. And when blind Mary had nowhere left in the world to go, it was Carrie's door she came to. Carrie's spare room. Carrie's house where she died. Almost no one who loves these books could tell you that, because the person it happened to is the sister the story forgot to write down. You know the books, you know the cabin, you know the fiddle and the snow and the long walk west. You know Mary went blind and Laura became a writer, and Pa could never quite sit still. You know the parts that became the books. You don't know what happened to the little one, the 4th chair at the table, the quiet girl in the background of every scene, who grew up and kept living and kept paying, long after the famous years were over and the readers had gone home. Tonight we follow Carrie Ingalls the whole way, from a one-room cabin on the Kansas prairie to a tar paper shanty she held down alone, to the clatter of a printing shop to a mining town under the Black Hills, beneath a mountain her own husband helped name and her own stepson helped carve, to the room where she sat with her blind sister at the very end. It is not a loud story. Carrie left us almost nothing in her own words, and that silence is part of what happened to her. But the record is there, in census pages and newspaper mastheads, in a Homestead file that cost her $14 to open and $80 to close, in a 2013 medical study that quietly rewrote what everyone thought they knew about her sister, in the dates carved on a row of stones in De Smet, South Dakota, a row you can still stand in front of today and read like a sentence. This is the story of the daughter nobody bet on, and how she ended up carrying the most famous family in American frontier history all the way to its grave. Turn the lamp down. We start where she started, in a cabin most of the world only knows as the title of a book. Start with the one fact almost everyone gets backward. The little house on the prairie, the one in the title, the cabin on the open Kansas grass, was not Laura's house. Not really. Laura was born 2 years earlier and a long way east in the Wisconsin woods. Mary, the eldest, was born earlier still, in a different Wisconsin cabin altogether. The Ingalls daughter, who was actually born on that prairie, in that house, in the place the whole world would later put on a book cover, was Carrie. August 3rd, 1870, a Wednesday, according to the family Bible. Montgomery County, Kansas, Rutland Township, 13 miles outside a brand new settlement called Independence. A cabin Charles Ingalls had built with his own hands on land that, strictly speaking, was not his to settle. Carolyn gave birth to her 3rd daughter there, on the floor of a one-room house, on a piece of ground the family would be gone from within a year and a half. Think about the timing for a moment, because it tells you who Carrie was going to be. She arrived at the worst possible moment of one of Pa's worst ideas. The Kansas claim was already falling apart. The family had moved onto land the government was in the middle of deciding they had no right to. By the next spring, the Ingallses would load the wagon and leave it all behind. The cabin, the broken-up field, the months of work, and turn back east with nothing to show for it but a new baby. So Carrie's very first journey, before she could hold her own head up, was a retreat. A failed claim behind her, a wagon under her, a mother doing the quiet arithmetic of starting over again. And there's a deeper shadow over that birthplace, one the books never touch. The land the Ingalses were squatting on wasn't empty. It was the Osage Diminished Reserve, ground that belonged by treaty to the Osage people, who were at that very moment being pressured and manoeuvred off it so that settlers exactly like Charles Ingalls could move in. The US Census Bureau itself, in a 2017 feature, describes the Ingalses as having settled on land belonging to the Osage Indians in 1869, wrongly believing the US government would soon open it to white settlement. The famous Little House on the Prairie, the cosy symbol of pioneer self-reliance that millions of children grew up loving, sat on someone else's homeland in the last months before that homeland was taken. Carrie was born into that too, into the part of the American story that the books, understandably, made gentle. The Osage were forced south into what is now Oklahoma between 1870 and 1872, the third displacement of their nation within 46 years, per the Oklahoma Historical Society. The Ingallses, as it happened, didn't even get to keep the spoils. The government's shifting line on who could settle where helped push them back off the claim before the year was out. So the very first year of Carrie's life contained, in miniature, the whole machinery of the frontier, land taken from one people, promised to another, and held by neither. She was born into the part of the story the books would later make beautiful. She just happened to be born into the version that didn't work. Here is what the record gives us about that baby, and what it doesn't. It gives us a birth date and a place. It gives us a name, Carolyn Celestia Ingalls, Carolyn for her mother, so that the household now held two Carolines, and the little one became Carrie to keep them straight. From the very beginning then, Carrie's name was a smaller version of someone else's, the diminutive, the one you used so as not to confuse her with the woman who mattered more. It is a small thing, and it is not nothing. The eldest daughter, Mary, carried her own name. The second, Laura, carried her own name. The third was given the mother's name and then shrunk down to fit beside it. Carolyn made into Carrie, an echo, a half-size copy of the woman the household revolved around. There is something almost too neat about it, as if the family had decided who she would be before she could speak. A smaller Carolyn, a quieter version of the one who held everything together, who would grow up to do exactly that, hold things together, and be remembered, like her name, as the lesser echo of someone larger. What the record does not give us is a strong child. Every account that survives, Laura's books, the family's own memory, the later biographies built on letters and interviews, agrees on one thing about Carrie. She was frail, small for her age, thin in a way that worried people, prone to whatever sickness was moving through her place. She was not, the way the others were described, sturdy. In a settled town in our century, that's a paediatrician's note, on the frontier in 1870, it was something closer to a sentence you didn't say out loud. Because everyone on that prairie had done the math the Ingallses were now doing without anyone teaching them how. Children died. They died of fevers no one could name, of winters that came too hard, of the long gap between a sick child and the nearest doctor. Caroline herself had grown up in a house the lake had widowed. Her own father, Henry Quiner, drowned in Lake Michigan when she was 5, her family held together by nothing but her mother's spine. Caroline knew, in her body, what it was to be the child of a household that could not afford to lose anyone, and lost them anyway. There is one more thing about Caroline worth knowing, because Carrie inherited it whole. Before she was Ma, before the Prairie, the moves, the long line of babies, Caroline Quiner had been an educated young woman, a schoolteacher, refined and careful, and quietly proud of a respectability her widowed mother had clawed back out of poverty. Then she married a charming, restless man with a fiddle and no money, and she spent the rest of her life smoothing the distance between the life she'd been raised to expect and the one his wandering actually gave her. That discipline, keep up appearances, keep the house decent, keep the need quiet, was Caroline's whole way of surviving, and she handed it straight to the daughter who carried her name. Carrie learned at her mother's side that you do not complain, you do not make a scene, you simply manage. It served her, and it cost her, in almost exactly equal measure for the whole of her life. And now she had a daughter who coughed too easily. By 1871, the family was gone from Kansas, back to Wisconsin, to the big woods, to the house Laura would later make famous as the beginning of everything, when in truth, for Carrie, it was already the second place she'd lived and lost. This is the pattern her whole childhood would take, and it's worth naming plainly, because the books smooth it into adventure, and the truth is harder than adventure. Carrie Ingalls did not have a childhood home. She had a sequence of them: Kansas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, twice, Iowa, Dakota Territory, a burned-out year running a hotel for someone else, a baby brother born in one town and buried before the family reached the next. By the time Carrie was a teenager, she had lived in more places than most people of her era saw in a lifetime, and the moving was not curiosity. It was Pa, chasing the next thing, one step ahead of the last thing that hadn't worked. The strong children turned that into a story. Laura, especially. Laura took all that instability and spun it decades later into the warmest childhood in American literature. That was Laura's gift, and, in a way, Laura's job, to make the wandering feel like wonder. Carrie didn't get that job either. What Carrie got was the wagon, the cold, the new schools where she was the small sick stranger again, the particular exhaustion of a child whose body is already struggling to keep up with a family that never stops moving. While Laura was gathering the raw material for 8 books, Carrie was simply trying to keep warm, keep up, and keep breathing. And then, when she was 10 years old, the family rolled into a brand new railroad town on the Dakota Prairie called De Smet, and the worst winter anyone there would ever see came down out of the north and sat on top of all of them for 7 months. That winter would make Laura a heroine and Pa a legend, in the books at least. What it did to Carrie, nobody put in a book at all. To understand Carrie, you have to understand that she never once got to be from somewhere. Most children, even poor ones, even hard-used ones, have a place. A house they picture when someone says the word home. Laura had that, or at least she built it later, out of memory and longing. The snug cabin in the Wisconsin woods, the fire, the fiddle, Pa's voice. That cabin became the emotional anchor of 8 books and 100 million readers' idea of what a childhood should feel like. Carrie didn't get an anchor. Carrie got a wagon. Walk the route with me, because the bare list of it tells you more than any description could. Carrie was born in Kansas in 1870. By 1871, before she could walk, the family had given up the illegal claim and rolled back east to the Wisconsin big woods. They stayed a few years. Then Pa heard about wheat country in Minnesota, and they went to Walnut Grove, to a dugout cut into the bank of Plum Creek, an actual hole in the ground with a sod roof, where the family lived while Pa gambled everything on a wheat crop. Grasshoppers ate the crop. 2 years running, a biblical cloud of them came down and stripped the fields to bare dirt, and the gamble failed. So they moved again. This time east to Burr Oak, Iowa, to run a hotel for another family. The Masters Hotel, a grim little establishment above a saloon on the Stagecoach Road, in a town Laura would later cut out of the official story entirely, because of what happened there. What happened there is the thing the moving years cost the family most directly, and it's worth stopping on because Carrie was old enough now to understand it. Somewhere in the middle of all that motion between Minnesota and Iowa, Caroline gave birth to a son, Charles Frederick, Freddie, the boy, the only Ingalls son, the child who in another era might have been the one to carry the name and work the land and ease his parents' old age. He was born on the 1st of November, 1875 in Walnut Grove. He lived 9 months, in August of 1876, while the family was visiting Charles's nephew, Peter Franklin Ingalls, in South Troy, Minnesota, a stop on the way to Burr Oak. Freddie sickened and died. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society describes him in a single line of the surviving record as a very sickly baby. The exact grave site is unknown. A modern memorial stands in the South Troy area, but no one is sure precisely where his small body was laid. Carrie was 5. Understand what that loss did to the family beyond the grief of it, because it shaped the world Carrie grew up in. Freddie had been the only son, and in that century, on that kind of land, a son was not only a child you loved, but a piece of the family's survival plan. A boy grew into the labour that worked the claim, the hands that would carry the name and the farm and ease his parents into old age. When Freddie died, the Ingalls lost their future as well as their baby. From then on, everything the family would ever build rested entirely on its daughters, on Mary and Laura and Carrie and the baby Grace. 4 girls in a world arranged for sons would have to be the whole of it. Carrie spent her life inside the consequences of that math, being relied upon, because in a family with no son, every daughter has to be load-bearing. Nobody knows exactly what she understood of it, but she was there, in the wagon, in the household, when the family's one son was lowered into the ground somewhere along the route and left behind as they moved on, because that was the other brutal arithmetic of the moving years. When you bury a child on the road, you don't get to stay near the grave. You keep going. You leave him where he fell, and you carry the grief with you to the next place, and the next. 2 of those stops deserve more than a line, because they are where Carrie's childhood actually happened. On Plum Creek, outside Walnut Grove, the family did not live in a house at first. They lived in a dugout, a room hollowed into the creek bank with a sod roof you could hear the cattle walking over. Carrie spent some of her earliest years in a hole in the ground, while her father bet the family's survival on a wheat crop, and the grasshoppers took it 2 years running. A living cloud that came down and ate the field, the garden, the curtains, the clothes off the line, until there was nothing green left for miles. And Burr Oak, the Iowa hotel town, was worse in a quieter way. The Masters Hotel was a rough establishment on the Stagecoach Road. The building still stands today, the only childhood home of Laura still on its original site, and the Ingalls family of 5 lived in a single 10-by-10 room directly below the tavern, where, on busy nights, as many as 30 men drank and fought. The children worked amid the noise of strangers drinking in the very stretch of years that Freddie died. It was the lowest point of the whole Ingalls story, so low that Laura, decades later, cut the town out of the books completely. There is no Burr Oak in the famous childhood, but Carrie was there. Carrie was always there for the parts that got cut. And here is a detail almost nobody knows, and that the books could not have told you even if they had wanted to. Grace, the baby, the youngest of the 4 Ingalls sisters, was born in Burr Oak on the 23rd of May, 1877. The year the books erased from the family's childhood was also the year the family grew. The lost year Laura never wrote about is the year her younger sister drew her first breath, in a 10-by-10 room above a saloon, with a sister 5 years old hovering somewhere nearby. Carrie's first memory of Grace, the sister she would one day bury, was made in the place the family later decided had not happened. They went back to Walnut Grove for a while after Burr Oak. Then, in 1879, Pa took a railroad job out west, and the family followed him to the very edge of settled country, to a brand new town site in Dakota Territory that didn't fully exist yet, a place called De Smet. By the time they got there, Carrie had lived in at least 5 different parts of the country, in cabins and dugouts and hotel rooms and claim shanties, and she was 9 years old. Here is the part the books never quite let you feel about all that moving. For Pa, each move was hope. The next place would be the one, the next crop, the next claim, the next town on the rising railroad. Charles Ingalls moved toward things, toward a future he could always see shining just past the horizon. For a frail child, every one of those moves was a subtraction. A new cold to get sick in. A new school full of strangers where she was the small odd new girl again. A new winter her thin body had to survive from scratch. Laura had the constitution and the temperament to turn the wandering into adventure. Carrie had the lungs that the wandering kept trying to close. And the family was about to stop moving, not because they'd found the shining place, but because they'd run out of road. De Smet was the end of the line, the last town site, the place where the Ingallses would finally, permanently settle. They settled there just in time for the worst winter the region would ever record to come down on top of them. She was 10 years old the winter the train stopped coming. The first blizzard hit on a Friday, October 15th, 1880. An early, savage storm that caught the whole Dakota region flat-footed before anyone had laid in supplies. It raged for 3 days, and it did not, the way storms usually do, give way to clear weather and a chance to dig out. It was the opening note of a season of storms, one behind the other, with barely a clear day between them, for 7 months. The histories call it the hard winter, or the long winter, and the people who lived through it spent the rest of their lives unable to talk about it casually. By January, the trains had given up entirely. The cuts west of town filled with packed snow faster than any crew could clear them, until the railroad simply announced there would be no more trains until spring and pulled its crews off the line. The superintendent was, in effect, writing the town off. He was telling a settlement of people that no help was coming for months, and that they would either find a way to feed and warm themselves or they wouldn't. No coal came in, no flour, no kerosene, nothing, so the town burned what it had. When the coal ran out, families twisted hay into tight hard sticks and fed those into the stove, one after another, all day, because a hay stick burns for only a few minutes. When the flour ran out, they ground seed wheat in coffee mills by hand, taking turns at the crank until their arms gave out, to make a coarse brown bread that was, for months, very close to all there was to eat. The grain that might have saved them was sitting in a homestead 12 miles out of town, and two young men, Ingalls Wilder and a friend named Cap Garland, gambled their lives crossing the open prairie between blizzards to go and buy it and bring it back. They returned with roughly 60 bushels of wheat, bought from a farmer who had quietly hidden stores against exactly this kind of catastrophe. That run became one of the most retold heroics in the whole Little House saga. It deserves to be. Cap Garland would die 10 years later, in 1891, in a threshing machine accident. A young man who had survived the worst winter on the prairie, only to be taken by his own equipment in a field at 26. But hold on to the frame. The heroes of the long winter, the ones the story remembers, were the strong young men who went out into the storm and came back with the wheat. The story has very little room for the people who simply endured it from inside, day after day, getting weaker. Now hold all of that, and put the smallest, thinnest body in town in the middle of it. Laura was 14 that winter, and strong. Pa was in his prime. Even Ma, careful and tough, was a grown woman with a grown woman's reserves. Carrie was 10, and she was the one whose body had never had much to spare in the first place. There is a moment in Laura's own account of that winter, and Laura, remember, was not in the business of dwelling on her little sister, where she lets it show. The family's grinding wheat, freezing, hungry, and Carrie is simply not keeping up. Too pale, too thin, getting thinner. Wilder writes it gently, the way you'd write something you didn't want to look at directly. But the fact underneath the gentle writing is plain enough. Of all of them, the one the long winter came closest to taking was Carrie. Try to feel one ordinary day of that winter from inside her body. You wake in a room where the water is frozen in the bucket. You eat a slice of dark, gritty bread ground by hand the night before, and there is not much of it, and there will not be more until someone grinds again. You take your turn at the coffee mill until your shoulders burn. You twist hay into sticks because there is nothing else to burn, and you feed them into the stove one after another, and still the cold finds you. The light is poor, the wind does not stop, and you do this not for a week, but for the better part of 7 months, while your already thin body has less and less to draw on. The strong came through it, lean and hungry. The frail child came through it, changed. She didn't die. That's the headline, and it's a real one. The Ingalls family walked out the far side of that winter into a late, muddy spring with everyone still breathing, and in a town where that was not guaranteed, it counted as a kind of victory. But survival is not the same as escaping unharmed, and this is where the books and the record start to part ways. The books end the long winter with the spring thaw, and the first train, and a barrel of treats, and a Christmas finally celebrated in May. A hardship survived. A story to tell. The record follows Carrie out of that winter and keeps going, and what it shows is a body that never fully came back. For the rest of her life, Carrie Ingalls would struggle with her lungs and her throat and her breathing. The Pioneer Girl Project records her lifelong complaint as throat ailments, hay fever, and the chronic congestion that left her gasping in certain seasons. She would spend decades chasing thinner, drier, easier air, moving herself across the map looking for somewhere her lungs could rest. The people who study this family have long drawn a quiet line back from all of that to one specific place. A 10-year-old, starving and frozen, grinding wheat in a town the trains had abandoned. We can't prove the line with a doctor's note. There wasn't one. The honest version is this. The long winter is where Carrie's lifelong frailty stops being a vague childhood trait and becomes a documented, lasting condition. Whether the winter caused it or simply finished a job her thin frame had already started, the timing is not an accident. The strong got the story, Carrie got the cost, and here is the part that tells you the most about the shape of her whole life. That winter became one of the most famous survival stories in American memory. Laura built a beloved book on it. The town built its identity on it. Alonzo Wilder, the young man who would marry Laura, became a minor legend for risking his life to bring back seed wheat, and people still tell that story. The person the winter actually marked the deepest got none of that. There is no chapter where Carrie is the hero of the long winter. There's barely a chapter where she's mentioned. She paid the highest physical price of anyone in that house and received, in the story everyone remembers, almost nothing. Not credit, not sympathy, not even much notice. That's the pattern setting in early. The strong ones got the story. Carrie got the cost, and the cost was not finished with her. Because the winter that nearly killed her was also indirectly about to take something from the sister beside her and rearrange the entire household around the loss. Watch what a family does after it nearly loses everything, because it tells you who that family is. The Ingallses came out of the long winter and did not slow down. There were claims to prove, crops to plant, a town to grow into, and there was Mary. Mary, the oldest. Mary, the careful, capable, golden one the family had quietly built its hopes around. What happened to Mary is worth telling properly, because it's the wound the whole family organised itself around, and because the official version of it was wrong for 100 years. In the spring of 1879, when Mary was 14, she came down with a violent illness, high fever, terrible headache, and then what the family called a stroke, which drew one side of her face down and left it briefly paralysed. For generations, everyone said it was scarlet fever. It's scarlet fever in the books, and scarlet fever on the school worksheets to this day. The Iowa Braille and Sight-Saving School Register recorded the diagnosis differently. Brain fever. But in 2013, a team of doctors, Alexson, Byington, Finkelstein and Tarini, went back through the contemporary newspaper accounts, the school records, and Laura's own careful descriptions, and published their findings in the journal Pediatrics. The symptoms didn't fit scarlet fever at all. The likeliest culprit was viral meningoencephalitis, an inflammation of the brain and its lining that can swell and destroy the optic nerves. It explains the fever, the headache, the facial paralysis, which actually resolved, ruling out a true stroke, and the way Mary's sight didn't vanish overnight but drained away over weeks, until what was left was permanent dark. She was 14. The careful, golden daughter, the one the family had pinned its future to, went blind on the edge of becoming a woman, and the family's whole shape changed around the loss. By the time the long winter came, Mary was already living in that dark, and the family's answer to that was the kind of thing that sounds noble in a sentence and cost a great deal in a life. They decided Mary would go to college. There was a school in Vinton, Iowa for the blind, the Iowa College for the Blind, a real institution with a real 7-year course, and the Ingalls, who never had money, decided they would find the money, whatever it took. Mary would not be left to sit in the dark. Mary would be educated. It was a beautiful decision. It was also a decision that had to be paid for, and the family that paid for it was not mostly Pa. It was the daughters. Laura's part is the famous one. Laura became Mary's eyes, describing the world out loud so Mary could keep seeing it second-hand. Laura took a teaching job at 15 in a cold-claimed shanty miles from home, with students nearly her own age, and she hated it. And she did it anyway, partly to help send Mary to Vinton. Laura's sacrifice is in the books where it belongs. Carrie's part is not in the books. But it was the same shape, just quieter. Because when the family pours itself into one child, the blind one, the one who needs the most, there is always another child who learns, fast and permanently, that her own needs come second or third. Carrie was that child. She was the healthy enough one, the one who wasn't blind and wasn't earning a wage yet, the one who could be counted on to need a little less so that Mary could have a little more. So Carrie did the thing that gets a person remembered for nothing. She helped. She filled in. She took the chores no one assigned because everyone assumed she'd do them. She grew up in the gap between the sister who needed constant care and the sister who'd left to earn money, and she made herself useful in that gap, which is the most thankless position in any household. Think about what her adolescence actually looked like. Mary away at the blind school in Iowa, then home again, needing things done for her, always. Laura away teaching, then married and gone for good by the time Carrie was 15. Laura wed Almanzo Wilder in 1885 and moved into her own life. Grace, the baby, still small and needing minding, and Carrie in the middle of all of it, not the one in crisis, not the one being launched, just the one who stayed and steadied and was relied upon. The record gives us a few hard facts from these years, and they're worth saying plainly, because they push back on the frail little nobody picture the TV show would later draw. Carrie finished her schooling. Around 1887 to 1888, the sources disagree slightly, and the Pioneer Girl Project suggests she became eligible to take the teaching exam around her 18th birthday in August 1888. She trained as a teacher and earned a teaching certificate, the same path Laura had taken, a genuine professional credential. She was a substitute teacher for a while. The Pioneer Girl Project, with characteristic care, notes that a certificate wasn't strictly needed to be hired as a substitute, but the credential itself was real. She was capable. She was bright enough to qualify. The sickly background girl was, on paper, exactly as accomplished as her famous sister. She just didn't have Laura's luck, or Laura's health, or Laura's knack for turning a hard life into a story people wanted to read. Carrie earned the certificate and then mostly worked other jobs, in the stores around De Smet, in a land office, wherever steady hands and a reliable manner were wanted. Picture the working life that actually filled her days, because it is nothing like the idle background child the show would later draw. Carrie clerked behind the counter at the dry goods stores on De Smet's main street, measuring out cloth and weighing goods for her neighbours. She worked in a land office, handling the dense, exacting paperwork of claims and deeds and abstracts, who owned what and when, and free of what debts. Work that does not forgive a careless mind. She moved between these jobs the way a capable single woman had to in a small frontier town, taking what was steady, making herself reliable, never quite earning enough to be free of the family and never quite allowed to be. She was, in the plainest sense, a working woman, decades before that phrase carried any glamour, up early, on her feet, useful to everyone, the sister who could always be counted on to hold a job and help at home and ask for very little back. And yet, and this is the turn that makes Carrie worth 2 hours of your night, she was not, underneath the frailty and the overlooking, a passive girl. The same years that asked her to disappear into the background were the years she quietly picked up the one thing that would become entirely her own, a trade, a skill with her hands that had nothing to do with being the family's spare set of helping arms. She learned to set type. A print shop in the 1880s was not a quiet place, and it was not, by the standards of the time, a place you expected to find a young woman. Picture it. A low room off the main street of De Smet, smelling of machine oil and the sharp metallic tang of lead. Along one wall, the type cases, shallow wooden drawers divided into dozens of little compartments, each holding hundreds of tiny lead letters, every letter in its own assigned slot. The compositor's job was to stand at those cases, read the handwritten copy propped in front of her, and build the words letter by letter, by hand, into a metal frame, upside down and backward, because that's how type prints, fast enough to put out a newspaper on a deadline. It was skilled work, it was physical work. Lead is heavy, and a day of it left your hands and your back aching. And it demanded the one quality Carrie had been forced to develop her whole life: patience under strain, the ability to do exacting work carefully while not feeling especially well. She took to it. The record is specific here, which is a gift. because so much of Carrie's life has to be read between the lines. The De Smet leader of November 2nd, 1889 carried a single-line announcement. Miss Carrie Ingalls has decided to become a typesetter and entered the leader office this week to learn the trade. A young woman's decision, recorded in the town paper the way the town paper recorded everything. Births, deaths, claim filings, the small public facts of a small public life. Carrie was 19. She had decided. She had walked into the office. The trade began. It helped that De Smet in those years was exactly the kind of place that needed typeset. A brand new railroad town on a rising frontier generated paper the way a boom town generates noise. Claim notices, legal advertisements, town gossip, the endless official announcements of a community inventing itself from nothing. Two newspapers sprang up and competed and eventually merged, the way frontier papers did, and all of it had to be built by hand, one lead letter at a time, by someone with the patience and the precision to do it. A small town on the edge of the map could not afford to be picky about whose hands those were. If a quiet, careful young woman could set clean type fast, the paper did not much care that she was quiet, careful, young, or a woman. Carrie worked the trade for some 15 years across the Dakota Territory. The De Smet News and De Smet Leader later combined. Later, when her life moved west, the Keystone Recorder and the Hill City Star. Sources at South Dakota Public Broadcasting also credit her with managing the Pedro Bugle and the Roseland Review. Small papers in small towns, the kind that lived or died on the steady hands of one or two people who could be trusted with the type. She crossed paths along the way with S.L. Sen, a colourful Dakota newsman known as the Proof King. A small detail of a working life, but a real one. This was not a hobby. It was a trade she carried across years and across the state. A marketable, respected skill in an era when a woman with a marketable, respected skill was rare enough to be worth noticing. Sit with the picture for a moment, because it is the exact opposite of the one the books and the show left us. The cute, fragile little sister, the one who barely speaks, the one you forget is in the room, is standing at a type case in a cold print shop, reading copy and building a newspaper out of 1,000 pieces of lead, by hand, faster than you could follow. Her fingers know where every letter lives without looking. She's good at this. She is, in this one room, not the frail one or the overlooked one or the one who needs minding. She is the compositor, and the paper does not go out without her. There is a rhythm to that work that gets into a person. The soft clack of the type dropping into the composing stick, line after line. The smell of ink and oil that never quite washes out of the hands. The deadline pressing while the press waited. The whole town's week of news and notices and gossip taking shape in her fingers. Backward and upside down. To be read forward by everyone she knew. It was demanding and humble at the same time. Invisible labour the whole community depended on without once thinking about who did it. Which is to say, it suited Carrie exactly. She was good at the thing nobody notices being done. And the trade tells you something about her mind that the frail little sister label hides completely. Setting type by hand is close work, fast work, work that punishes the impatient and the careless. You're reading, spelling, spacing and reversing all at once against a clock with 1,000 tiny pieces of metal that all look nearly alike. People who could not do it well did not last at it. Carrie lasted at it for years across several papers and 2 halves of the state. Whatever else the world decided she was, the print shop knew the truth. She was precise, she was quick, and she was dependable under pressure. Which is to say she was, in the one place that measured her by her work instead of her health, quietly excellent. There is a particular dignity in that, and it's worth naming because Carrie's story could so easily be told as nothing but loss. The sick one, the overlooked one, the one things were done to. The trade complicates that in the best way. It is the first place in her life where Carrie is clearly, provably, the author of her own competence. Nobody assigned her the type case the way they assigned her the chores. She learned it. She got good at it. She made it hers. And it gave her something the chores never could. A way out of the family's gravity. A skill is portable. A skill means you can go somewhere and be useful to strangers, for wages, on your own. For a woman in the 1880s and 1890s, that was close to the only honest door to independence there was, and Carrie had found it and walked through it before most people had even noticed she'd grown up. But independence, for Carrie, always came with the same shadow attached, and the shadow was her own body. Because the better she got at standing on her own, the more her health kept insisting that standing on her own was going to be a fight. The lungs the long winter had marked, the throat that closed up, the seasons that left her gasping. A trade could carry her out of the house. It could not carry her out of her own chest. So the next chapter of Carrie's life becomes a strange, quiet contest between a woman determined to build something of her own and a body equally determined to make her pay for every mile of it. And the first place that contest would play out was on a piece of empty prairie she decided, against every reasonable expectation, to claim entirely by herself. There is a photograph that should be more famous than it is. Carrie Ingalls, somewhere in her 30s, in front of her tar paper claim shanty on the open prairie west of the Missouri. She's small in the frame, the shack is small in the frame, everything else is grass and sky, and the line where they meet. That photograph is the physical proof of one of the most quietly defiant things she ever did. To understand how unlikely that picture is, you have to understand what proving up actually meant. The government did not give land away for nothing. It gave you a claim, and then it made you earn the deed by living on the raw land, building on it, staying through the requisite stretch of time and the seasons that came with it. It was designed, frankly, for a family, for a man with a wife and sons and animals and the combined muscle to break sod and hold ground. It was not designed for a single woman alone, and it was certainly not designed for a single woman with bad lungs and a history of nearly not surviving winters. Carrie did it anyway. You have to understand the land hunger of those years to see how strange her choice was. In the early years of the new century, the government opened tracts of former reservation land, ground taken from the Lakota and the other Plains nations across the preceding decades, to white settlement, often by lottery. People came by the thousands and the tens of thousands, lining up to register for a chance at a quarter section of their own. It was one of the last great land rushes in American history, a frenzy of hope and paperwork and raw acquisition, and the great majority of the people in those lines were men, or families with a man at the front. On the 30th of September, 1907, Carrie walked into the land office at Pierre, South Dakota, and paid $14 to file on 160 acres. The legal description is precise, in the way of these things. The west half of the northwest quarter and the west half of the southwest quarter of Section 9, Township 4 North, Range 20 East, Black Hills Meridian. The land sat in a community called Top Bar, sometimes written as one word, Top Bar, about 20 miles north of the little town of Philip and 90 miles west of Pierre, in what was then Stanley County and is now Harcon County. Country so empty the name barely attached to anything. The shanty she put up there was 10 feet by 12, one room, frame walls covered in tar paper and lath, a coal shed beside it, no barn, no stable, nothing else for miles. The wind came across that country with nothing to slow it for 100 miles. She began her residence in the spring of 1908 and lived out there the required 6 months, alone. Then, in December of 1908, she went back to Pierre and paid $80, 50 cents an acre, to commute the claim, converting it from a homestead she would have had to prove up over years into a cash purchase. The final land patent, the document that made the ground legally hers, was issued in September of 1909. The numbers are exact because the government kept them. $14 to open the file, $80 to close it, 160 acres with her name on the paper and no one else's. Picture the nights, because the nights are the part nobody tells you about a homestead claim. The shanty was a single thin-walled room, tar paper tacked overboard, on a sweep of treeless prairie, where the nearest neighbour might be a mile or two off and invisible after dark. The wind never really stopped. It worked at the paper and the seams all night, a sound like something always trying to get in. There was no one to call, no telephone, no near help, nothing between a woman alone and the open country but a latch, A storm could pin you for days, a sickness, and Carrie was a woman who got sick easily, had to be ridden out alone by lamplight, with the wind pulling at the walls. People romanticize the homestead now, the way they romanticize everything about that era. The reality was long stretches of solitude and exposure and quiet endurance, and Carrie chose it, season after season, on purpose, with a body that had every reason to choose safety instead. Why? The record doesn't make her explain herself, and maybe she never did. But the shape of it is plain enough. After a lifetime of being the one looked after, the one watched over, the one defined by what she couldn't do, Carrie wanted just once to hold something entirely on her own. And she did. She proved up the claim. The land became hers, in a government file with her name on it. Not a sister, not a wife, not the family's frail dependent, but Carrie Ingalls, landholder, alone. It is hard to overstate how unusual that sentence was for a woman of her time. The whole legal architecture of the homestead, the residence requirement, the improvement requirement, the years of proving up, assumed a household with a man in it. A single woman could file, and some brave ones did, but they were a small minority, swimming against every assumption their society held about what a woman was for and what she could do unaccompanied. The South Dakota Historical Society Press notes that Carrie joined the many other single women who took advantage of the Homestead Act, but the many was always a small fraction of the whole. Carrie, sick and slight and quiet, joined that minority and finished the course. When the patent came through in September 1909, the federal government of the United States certified in writing that this frail spinster from a wandering family had taken a piece of raw prairie and held it alone until it was hers. No husband's name on it, no father's, just hers. It may be the single most defiant thing she ever did, and she did it without raising her voice. That phrase is worth keeping, because it is the key to all of Carrie. Her whole life is a series of quietly defiant acts that never look like defiance, because she never performed them. She did not announce that she would learn a man's trade. She just learned it. She did not declare that she would hold land alone. She just held it. She did not protest being overlooked. She just kept doing more than the overlooked are supposed to be capable of. A louder person doing half as much would have been remembered as a pioneer, a trailblazer, a woman ahead of her time. Carrie did the things and skipped the announcement, and so the things happened, and the credit never attached. That is not an accident of her story. It is the whole pattern of it. Stop and feel the weight of that, because the books never let you. The fragile sister, the one the family braced to lose, the one the long winter nearly took, the one whose chest seized up in bad weather, chose, as a grown woman, to go out alone onto the emptiest land in the state and prove she could hold it. Not because anyone made her, because she wanted something of her own, a piece of ground with her name on the paper, proof written into a government file that Carrie Ingalls was not only the helper, the spare, the one things happened to. She could stake a claim and keep it, by herself. The myth made Carrie small. The Homestead file makes her something the myth had no category for. A single woman in the early 1900s in poor health, quietly doing one of the hardest and most independent things her era offered, with no husband to do it for her and no story being written to celebrate her for it. In December of 1905, Carrie Ingalls left De Smet and went to Colorado. The reason was as plain as a reason gets. She was sick, and she was tired of being sick, and people in that era believed, sometimes rightly, that certain air was better for failing lungs. Boulder sat up against the Rockies, high and dry, and it had built part of its reputation on exactly this. People came there to breathe. Picture what that move actually was. A woman in her mid-30s, unmarried, unwell, boarding a train alone in the dead of a Dakota December and riding hundreds of miles to a town where she knew almost no one, to a boarding house among strangers because the air there might let her sleep without fighting for it. No family waited in Boulder. No husband, no household, no claim. Just the mountains and the dry cold and the faint desperate hope that a change of climate could do what no doctor at home had managed. She stayed a while, worked where she could, and eventually came back. Because the quiet truth about the health seekers' migration is that most of them never found the cure they crossed the country for. They found, at best, a few easier seasons and the company of other people chasing the same impossible thing. Carrie was one of thousands moving across the map in search of a breath, and like most of them, she carried her bad lungs with her wherever she went. And think about what leaving actually meant for a woman in her position. She was in her mid-30s, unmarried, leaving the only town her family had ever permanently called home, boarding a train alone to go and live among strangers a state away. Not for adventure, not for love, not for opportunity, but simply because she could no longer breathe where her people were. There is a particular loneliness in that kind of departure. The healthy leave home to chase something. The sick leave home to survive, and they leave the network of people who know them and would help them, trading it for clean air and isolation. Carrie made that trade more than once. Every move on her map after De Smet is a small act of exile, chosen not because she wanted to go, but because her lungs would not let her stay. She was part of a much larger movement without ever meaning to be. In that era, before antibiotics, before any real treatment for the diseases of the lungs, half medicine and half faith sent a whole population of sick Americans west in search of air. They were called health seekers, and they came by the thousands to Colorado and the high dry country, chasing the widely held belief that the right climate could do what no doctor could: ease a failing chest, slow a wasting cough, buy a few more years. Some of them were dying of tuberculosis. Some, like Carrie, simply could not breathe where they were. Whole towns built their economies on these people, on the promise of air. Carrie joined that quiet migration of the unwell, looking, like all of them, for somewhere her own body would let her stay. It's a small fact, easy to read past. A woman takes a trip for her health, but slow down on it, because it's the whole second act of her life in miniature. Carrie spent her adult years in a kind of slow migration governed not by ambition or romance, but by air. Where could she breathe? That question moved her around the map. De Smet, Boulder, back again, and eventually into the Black Hills, more than any dream ever moved her father, and with far less to show for it in the way of stories. Pa moved chasing the next big thing. Carrie moved chasing the next breath. One of those got 8 books written about it. The other got a one-line mention in a genealogy, and everywhere she went, she worked. This is the part that keeps Carrie from being only a sick woman in a series of waiting rooms. She set type for newspapers in the new places. She clerked in stores. She worked in a land office handling abstracts, the dry exacting paperwork of who owned what. Wherever Carrie landed, she made herself useful, and she earned her own keep, the same way she had since she was a girl. The frailty never once translated into idleness. She was unwell for most of her life, and she worked through almost all of it. There is a particular dignity in that worth pausing on, because it is so easy to miss. We are used to thinking of illness as something that happens instead of a life. The sick person set aside, waited on, defined by the waiting. Carrie refused that, not with any grand declaration, but simply by getting up and going to work year after year in town after town with a body that gave her every excuse not to. She was not a woman whose story is illness. She was a woman who worked through illness for 60 years, which is a far harder and far less told thing. The cough was real. The asthma was real. The seasons that left her gasping were real. And underneath all of it, every day was a woman setting type, keeping books, minding a counter, holding a claim, earning, contributing, carrying her own weight and usually some of everyone else's too. Let me set down where we are because we've come a long way from a baby in a Kansas cabin, and the shape of the whole thing matters more than any single fact in it. Here is Carrie Ingalls by her late 30s. The child everyone expected to lose has outlasted that expectation by decades. She has a trade. She has held land alone. She has earned her own money in 6 towns. She has done quietly and without applause almost everything a person of her time could do to build a life on her own terms. And she has done all of it while sick and while overlooked, and while every bit of attention the family had to give went, understandably, to the blind sister and the famous one. What she does not have still is the one thing the world of 1908 would have counted as a life. A home of her own with people in it, a husband, children. By every conventional measure, Carrie at 38 was a woman whose story had not started, and the conventional wisdom of her era would have quietly written her off as a spinster, the family's permanent maiden aunt, the one who'd help raise everyone else's children and have none of her own. Understand how heavy that label sat in that era, because it was not a neutral thing. A woman past 35 and unmarried was, in the eyes of her world, a small failure no one was rude enough to name aloud, a daughter who had not completed the one task a woman's life was supposed to be for. She became the aunt who came to help when babies were born, and when people were dying, useful at everyone else's milestones and possessing none of her own, loved, often, but also quietly pitied and given the spare room. For most women that role hardened into permanence by 40. Carrie had every reason to assume it was her whole future. The maiden sister, the helper, growing old in the margin of other people's families. She had built a real life of her own, the trade and the land and the work. But the world did not count those as a life. It counted the husband and the children she did not have. That's the open question hanging over her as the years tick toward 1910. Will Carrie ever get a life that is simply fully hers? Or is the one who helps, the one who manages, the one who breathes badly and carries on the whole of it? If you've stayed with me this far into the dark, stay a little longer. Because the answer, when it comes, arrives from the one direction nobody in the family was watching. Not from De Smet, not from the Prairie she'd given her health to, from a granite mining town tucked into the Black Hills, where a widower with 2 motherless children was about to change the entire second half of Carrie Ingalls' life. Keystone, South Dakota, was a hard little town built on gold. It sat in a narrow gulch in the Black Hills, the country the Lakota called sacred and the United States had taken anyway a generation before, a place of mines and stamp mills and men who came looking for ore. That taking had a date and a name, and it sits closer to this family story than you would ever guess. In 1868, the United States signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota, guaranteeing the Black Hills to them in perpetuity as part of the Great Sioux Reservation. The treaty was, in writing, a promise. In 1874, an army expedition under George Armstrong Custer rode into the Black Hills anyway, and confirmed what the rumours had promised: gold, in the streams, in the sacred heart of Lakota country, that a signed treaty had guaranteed to the Sioux forever. The rush came within months. Miners poured in against the law, the government followed by simply seizing the land, and a war followed that. And Custer rode out of it 2 years later to his death at the Little Bighorn. Keystone was one of the towns that grew out of that theft, a gold camp on stolen sacred ground. And it was here, 2 generations later, that Carrie Ingalls found the kindest heir of her life, and the only home that was ever fully her own. The frontier gave with one hand precisely what it had taken with the other, and almost nobody living inside it ever stopped to feel the weight of that. In 1980, in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the seizure of the Black Hills had been illegal and awarded the Lakota compensation. The Lakota refused the money. They wanted the land back. The award, with interest, has grown to more than $1 billion and remains unclaimed because the Lakota have never wavered. The Black Hills are not for sale. Carrie Ingalls lived the back half of her life on that ground, in the shadow of that refusal, breathing easier on land that had been somebody else's holy place. Keystone is where Carrie came, sometime in the years before 1912, to set type for the local paper and to breathe the thinner mountain air. And it is where she met David Niven Swanzey. Swanzey was a mine owner and a fixture of the town, older than Carrie by more than 15 years, born on the 18th of April, 1854 in St. Louis, Missouri. He had come to the Black Hills in the 1890s as a gold prospector and staked a placer claim along Grizzly Creek, which made him one of the early white men to put down roots in Keystone. He was a widower. His first wife, the former Elizabeth Jane Gordon, whom he had married in October of 1899, had died in 1909, leaving him with 2 young children to raise alone, a boy named Harold, born December 20th, 1906, and a girl named Mary. He needed, in the plain arithmetic of the time, a wife. Carrie, at 40, was a capable, intelligent, hard-working woman who had spent her entire life learning how to step into the gap where someone was needed. On the 1st of August, 1912, in Rapid City, South Dakota, with the ceremony performed by an Episcopal clergyman named Reverend Spaulding, they married. Carrie was 41 years old. She would turn 42 2 days later. They honeymooned in Hot Springs, South Dakota, and then they went home to Keystone. There's a temptation to read that coldly, a practical match, a marriage of convenience, an aging spinster and a widower who needed a manager for his household. And maybe some of that is true. Most marriages in that time had some of that in them. But it misses what actually happened to Carrie, which was bigger and warmer than convenience. At 41, the woman who was supposed to die first, the woman the world had written off as the permanent helper, walked into a house and a family of her own. Her husband, David Swanzey, is remembered by history for something most people would never guess sits this close to the Little House story. He's credited as one of 3 men who participated in the naming of Mount Rushmore. The story, as the Keystone Historical Society tells it, goes like this. In 1884 or 1885, the sources vary, David Swanzey and a fellow prospector named Bill Challis were guiding a New York City attorney named Charles E. Rushmore through the hills. Rushmore had been sent west to check legal titles on mining properties. At some point during that expedition, the question of what to call a particular granite peak came up, and the mountain was named, half in jest, half in earnest, for the visiting New Yorker. Charles E. Rushmore would later donate land around the mountain. The name stuck, so Carrie Ingalls, the forgotten sister from the Prairie books, married the man who, with 2 others, gave Mount Rushmore its name. But the story does not stop there. Hold on to it, because it gets stranger. Carrie's stepson Harold, the boy she raised from the age of 6, grew up to work as one of the carvers on Mount Rushmore itself. Between 1927 and 1941, while Guts and Borgelum's crews blasted and drilled 4 presidential faces into the granite a few miles up the gulch from Carrie's house, Harold Swanzey was one of the workers hanging off the mountain. He is listed today on the National Park Service's page of Mount Rushmore workers. Carrie thus personally knew both the man who named the mountain and the man who carved it, the man she married and the boy she raised. 2 generations of her family, 2 ends of one of the most recognized monuments in the world. And then, on the 16th of April 1939, Harold Swanzey was killed in a car accident near Keystone. He was 32 years old. Carrie, by then, an aging widow in her late 60s, buried the stepson she had raised. The boy who had carved the mountain was lowered into the ground beneath the mountain his stepfather had named, and Carrie stood at the edge of the grave. The girl the books couldn't be bothered to develop ended her story underneath the most famous rock in America. Nobody wrote that down as remarkable. It simply was. For a while, and Carrie had earned a while, this is the good part. A home, a husband, children who called her mother, mountain air that was kinder to her chest than the Prairie had ever been. After 40 years of coming second, Carrie Ingalls and Keystone finally got to come first in something, and the something was a family. She raised Harold and Mary Swanzey as her own, in the house in Keystone for the rest of her life. She was, by every sign, good at the part that mattered most, the mothering. The children were not hers by blood, and she bore none of her own, and yet the family she actually raised, the only children she would ever mother, were these 2, in the gulch under the mountain. It is one more quiet inversion in a life full of them. The sister written off as the barren maiden aunt spent her happiest decades as somebody's mother. After nearly half a century of being the one who helped raise other people's importance, Mary's education, Laura's freedom, the family's stability, Carrie finally had a household where she was not the spare. She was the centre of it. But the family she'd been born into was not finished with her. One by one, out on the prairie she'd left behind, the people she'd grown up helping were getting older. Pa was already gone. Ma was aging. And Mary, blind Mary, the sister the whole family had organised itself around since before the long winter, was moving slowly and inevitably toward the day when she would need somewhere to go and someone to take her in. When that day came, it would not be the famous sister who opened her door. It would be Carrie. In April of 1924, Caroline Ingalls, Ma, died in De Smet. The date matters, and not only because dates matter. The 20th of April, 1924, was Easter Sunday. Caroline Lakewinner Ingalls, born in Milwaukee in December of 1839, died in her home on a Sunday morning the Christian calendar calls Resurrection. She was 84 years old. She'd spent the last 22 years of her life a widow, sharing that house with blind Mary, the two of them keeping each other company in the home Pa had left behind. For all those years, the arrangement had quietly answered a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. What happens to Mary? The answer had always been, Ma. Ma takes care of Mary. Ma always had. And then Ma was gone, and the question had no answer anymore. Mary was 59 years old and completely blind. She had never married, never had children, never spent a day of her adult life able to live alone. And now the one person whose whole late life had been built around caring for her was dead. Mary could not stay in the De Smet house by herself. It was not possible. Someone in the family had to take her in fully for the rest of her life, however long that was. This is the quiet fact at the centre of Carrie's whole story, and it's the one the books and the show would never tell you, because it rearranges who the heroes are. Laura was the famous one. Laura was, by 1924, a successful farm woman in Mansfield, Missouri, with a grown daughter, Rose, by then in her late 30s, and a comfortable life and a writing career about to begin. Laura had been Mary's eyes, once, long ago, in the stories everyone loves. Laura was, by every measure the world used, the obvious choice, the famous sister, the successful sister, the sister with the means. But when blind Mary actually needed a home for the end of her life, it was not Missouri she went to. For a while after Ma died, Mary lived with Grace, the youngest, over in Manchester, south of town on Grace and Nathan Dow's farm. But Grace and Nathan had their own difficulties. Nathan was aging. The Dows had lost their farm in the agricultural collapse of the 1920s. The arrangement could not hold. And so Mary came to Keystone, to Carrie, to the small sister with the bad lungs, in the gulch beneath the mountain, in the house already full with a husband and 2 stepchildren. Carrie took her blind sister in and cared for her, in the plainest and hardest sense of the word, the way Ma had, the way someone always had to. And understand what that actually meant, because it was not a sentimental thing. It was labour, every day without an end you could see. Mary could do a great deal for herself. The blind school in Vinton had trained her for 7 years, from 1881 to 1889, and the training had taken. She read raised print by touch. She made fine beadwork, some of which still survives in museum collections today. She wove hammocks and nets. She carried a trained memory that held whole books, and she played music. She had grown into a person of quiet dignity, who had spent half a century refusing to be merely the family's tragedy. By the time she arrived in Keystone in 1924, Mary had been blind for 45 years. By the time she died in Carrie's house, it would be 49. Nearly her entire adult life had been lived in the dark, none of which changed the one hard fact underneath. She could not live alone, and never had. So what Carrie took on was not a burden of pity, but a duty of love and labour combined. The daily care of a capable, particular, beloved older sister who simply needed eyes, for as long as she had left. Carrie gave her that. The frail one gave the blind one a home, and 4 years of it, and a place to die that was warm and among family. Picture the house now. Carrie, in her 50s, never strong, managing a household that contains a husband, a stepson, a stepdaughter named Mary, and a blind sister named Mary. The woman who was supposed to be too frail to manage her own survival is running a home and tending a blind woman and doing it, as far as the record shows, without complaint and without anyone outside the family particularly noticing. And then, in Carrie's house, the long story of Mary Ingalls came to its end. But that is the next chapter, and it deserves its own room. There were 2 women named Mary in Carrie Ingalls' house, and the strangeness of that is worth sitting with, because it's the kind of thing a novelist would be told to cut for being too on the nose. One Mary was her stepdaughter, David Swanzey's daughter, the girl Carrie had raised in Keystone since 1912 as her own. The other Mary was her blind older sister, the one back on the prairie, the one the whole Ingalls family had spent 40 years arranging itself around. By the end, Carrie would be caring for both of them under the same roof. The sickly little sister, the one nobody expected to be able to take care of herself, became the one who took care of the 2 Marys. Here is what those years in Keystone actually held. Mary had her beadwork and her knitting. She had her music. She had, for the first time in decades, a household with other women in it. Carrie and the younger Mary, and the rhythms of a working family around her. She had the mountain air that was kinder to her sister's lungs than the prairie had ever been. She had, in short, the kind of home any blind woman of her era would have counted herself lucky to land in. And she had Carrie, the sister she'd grown up beside in the dugout and the hotel and the claim shanty, the sister who'd been 5 years old when their baby brother was lowered into the ground, the sister whose lungs had nearly given out in the long winter, while Mary, already blind, sat in the dark and listened to the wind, the sister who had learned, somewhere in all those years, to need less so that Mary could have more. Now, in the back half of their lives, that arrangement had simply continued, but with Carrie doing the needing less and Mary doing the having more in a different house under a different mountain. 4 years. That is how long the arrangement lasted. 4 years of Carrie running a household that contained, at various points, a husband, 2 stepchildren, and a blind older sister, and doing it on a body that had been quietly giving out since she was 10. In the autumn of 1928, Mary suffered a stroke. Not long after, pneumonia took hold, and on a day in late October, Mary Ingalls died in Keystone, in Carrie's home at the age of 63. Here is the small thing. The records cannot agree on the date. Some say October 17th, 1928. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Memorial Society in De Smet, the official historical society, the people most invested in getting the family's dates right, gives October 17th. Find a grave, Family Search, Ancestry and Genie.com all give October 17th. Others say October 20th. Wikipedia and Wikidata give October 20th. Wikitree gives October 20th. So do several secondary blogs. A 3-day disagreement, in the year of our Lord 1928, over the date of death of the most famous blind woman in American children's literature. It is its own small proof of how little the world was watching. Mary Ingalls, the Mary, and the official record cannot agree on which of 3 days she died. Think about who was there. Not the famous sister. Not a husband or a child of Mary's own. She'd had neither. The person who sat with Mary Ingalls at the end, in whose house she drew her last breath, was Carrie, the overlooked one, the frail one, the one the family had braced to lose first 50 years before, now closing the eyes of the sister the whole family had been built around. They took Mary's body back to De Smet and buried her in the family plot next to Pa and Ma. The coffin travelled by train, east across the prairie, back to the town where Mary had been a girl with sight, back to the cemetery where her parents already lay. Carrie went with her, or sent her. The record does not say which, and it does not matter. What matters is that Mary came home, and Carrie went back to Keystone to her husband and her stepchildren and the mountain, having done the last and largest thing the family ever asked of her. And when Mary died, she left behind the small, careful proofs of a life that had refused to be only a tragedy. The beadwork her fingers had learned in the dark at the blind school, the woven nets, the trained memory that had held whole books. It was not much in the way of things. Blind, unmarried, dependent women do not accumulate much. But it was enough to say that Mary Ingalls had been a person, and not merely a misfortune. and the one who gathered up those last belongings, who closed the account of the family's most famous suffering, and saw it home to the de Smet graves, was the sister history would trouble itself to remember least. Nobody marked what it had cost her. 4 years of daily care for a blind woman, layered onto a household and a body that had never been strong, ending in a deathbed vigil. That is a great deal to ask of anyone, and an enormous amount to ask of the one person everyone had spent 50 years calling the weak one. But that was the quiet genius of how the family had always seen Carrie. Because she never refused, the asking never registered as a request. It was simply assumed. Of course Carrie would take Mary. Of course Carrie would manage. She always had. The reliability that should have earned her the family's gratitude instead earned her its invisibility, which is the cruel logic that governs the lives of dependable people everywhere. She'd outlived the daughter the family pinned its hopes on. She'd outlived the mother who held them all together, and she was not, it turned out, anywhere near finished saying goodbye. Grief, for some people, comes all at once. For Carrie it came in installments, spread across 4 decades, each one taking another piece of the family she'd grown up inside. Pa went first, and earliest. Charles Ingalls, the restless father, the fiddle player, the man who could never quite stay still, died in de Smet in the summer of 1902, of heart trouble, at 66. He had been ill for several weeks. The official cause, in modern terms, was cardiovascular disease. He died at his home on 3rd Street in the town he had finally stopped moving in. Carrie was 31, not yet married, still in the Prairie years, still proving claims and setting type. There is one small thing the books never mention about Pa, and it matters for what comes later. Charles Ingalls was a Freemason. He had petitioned de Smet Lodge No. 55 in December of 1885, joined the Order of the Eastern Star in 1893, along with his daughters Carrie and Laura, and when he died in 1902 he was given Masonic funeral rites. That fraternal thread runs through the whole family like a quiet wire. It is going to come back, 44 years later, in the very last thing Carrie does. Think about the irony of Pa's ending, because it's almost unbearable. The man who had moved his family across half a continent chasing the next horizon, Kansas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Dakota, finally stopped moving for good, in a town bed, in the one place he'd ever stayed. The restless heart simply wore out. And his death quietly tightened the circle around the women who were left, because Pa, for all his wandering, had been the family's centre of gravity. With him gone, the household became what it would be for the rest of its existence, a group of women holding each other up, and it landed hardest, in the plain practical sense, on the daughters who had not married out. Mary, blind and dependent. Carrie, still single, still in de Smet. The two of them and Ma were now a household of women with no man's wage and no man's labour behind them, on the frontier, making their own way. Carrie's typesetting and clerking and homesteading stopped being only a private ambition in that moment and became part of how the remaining family kept itself afloat. Pa's death did not just take a father. It quietly turned Carrie, at 31, into one of the people the others would now lean on to survive, which is the role she would carry, without being thanked for it, for the next 40 years. Then Ma Caroline Ingalls had spent the 22 years after Pa's death, a widow, sharing the de Smet house with blind Mary, the two of them growing old together in the home he'd left behind. She had been the careful, unbreakable centre of the family her whole life, the one who flinched at debt, who kept the house respectable through every failed move, who buried her grief so deep that her own children rarely saw it. In April of 1924, on Easter Sunday, she died, at 84. And with her went the last of the old order, the generation that remembered the big woods, the wagon, Freddie, all of it. Picture the town for that funeral, because it is a small, telling scene. De Smet, the family's final stopping place, the end of all the roads, gathered to bury the mother of the family. Carolyn Quinner Ingalls, who had come west a young bride with a green-eyed dreamer and outlasted him by more than 2 decades, who had buried a son and watched a daughter go blind and held a household together through more failures than most marriages survive. They laid her in the De Smet plot beside Charles, and among the mourners, already doing the arithmetic of what came next, stood Carrie. Because Ma's death was not only a grief, it was a logistical fact, and the fact had Mary's name on it. Before the ground had even settled, the question that had hung over the family for 50 years came due, and it came due to the sister least equipped, on paper, to answer it. After Mary came home to De Smet for burial, Carrie went back to Keystone, but the house she returned to was no longer the one she had left. In April of 1938, David Swanzey died in Keystone after 26 years of marriage. He was more than 15 years older than Carrie, and he had been a part of her life for the entire back half of it. His burial was in the Keystone Cemetery, on the ground he had helped settle. Sit with the particular loneliness of that, because it is sharper than it looks. The marriage had been the one long stretch of her life when she was not the spare, not the helper, not the one fitted into the cracks of someone else's story, but a wife, in her own home, the centre of a household built around her. For 26 years she had finally come first. And then that was taken too, and she was alone in the Keystone house in a way she had never quite been alone before. Not the busy, useful solitude of the Homestead shanty, but the empty solitude of a woman who has, one by one, outlived everyone who ever needed her. And the children she had raised were grown now. Harold, the stepson who would carve the mountain, was killed in a car accident on the 16th of April, 1939, not quite a year after his father's death. Carrie buried him too. The younger Mary, her stepdaughter, had her own life. The Keystone house emptied out around Carrie in a way she could not fill. Outside her window, the mountain was finishing. All through the years Carrie had lived in Keystone, Gutzon Borglum's cruise, and for part of that time, her own stepson Harold had been carving the four faces into the granite a few miles up the gulch. Drills and dynamite, scaffolds and dust, the slow emergence of four giant men chosen precisely because the country wanted to make certain they would never be forgotten. The work had been underway through Mary's last years in the house, and it ground on through the deaths and the quiet, and in 1941 it stopped, more or less finished, and the monument became what it would be for all time. The timing is almost too neat to bear. In the very stretch of years that America completed the largest monument to remembrance it had ever attempted, a few miles below it the woman who had quietly held the most remembered family in the country together slipped further and further out of anyone's memory. A widow alone in a house, tending the graves of people the tourists would one day drive straight past her own to reach. And then there was one fewer of them still. Out in Manchester, in November of 1941, the diabetes that ran in these sisters' blood took Grace, the baby, the last of the four besides Carrie and far-off Laura. Grace Pearl Ingalls Dow died on the 10th of November 1941 at 64 in Manchester, and was buried in the De Smet family plot beside her parents and Mary. Her husband Nathan would follow her less than 2 years later, in May of 1943. Count it now, the way Carrie must have, alone in the house under the mountain. Her father, her mother, Mary, Grace, her husband, her stepson. 6 of them gone, and Carrie still here. The one who, by every expectation anyone ever had, should have been the first name on that list, not nearly the last. The frail one. The sickly one. The one the long winter almost took when she was 10. She had outlived the strong sister, and the careful mother, and the wandering father, and the baby of the family, and the husband who had loved her, and the stepson she had raised. She had, in the plainest terms, helped bury most of the people she'd spent her life helping. There is only one sister left who outlives her, and that sister is about to do something that will fix Carrie's place in history forever. Here is the cruelest coincidence of timing in the whole story, and it is nobody's fault, which somehow makes it land harder. In the very years that Carrie was burying her family and caring for the dying and aging quietly in a granite town, her sister Laura, down on a farm in Missouri, was turning all of it into books. In 1932, when Carrie was 61, the first one appeared, Little House in the Big Woods. Laura was 65 and had never published a book in her life, and it found readers almost at once. Over the next 11 years, the rest came, one after another: the Wisconsin woods, the Kansas prairie, the dugout on Plum Creek, the shores of Silver Lake, the long winter, the little town, the golden years. 8 books in all, the last of them in 1943. By the time the last one appeared, the Ingalls family was on its way to becoming one of the most beloved families in the history of American letters, and Laura Ingalls Wilder was on her way to a kind of immortality almost no writer ever reaches. Carrie was alive for all of it. She lived to see her own childhood become a national treasure. Sit with how strange that must have been. Somewhere in Keystone, an aging woman with bad lungs could pick up a book everyone was talking about, a book children across the country were falling asleep to, and read the story of her own family. The cabin she'd been born in, the grasshoppers that ate the crop, the dugout on Plum Creek, the long winter that had nearly killed her, written down at last, beautifully, for the whole world to hold. And she could find, in those pages, herself, a small character named Carrie, the little sister, present in the background of the important scenes, almost never the point of any of them, the frail one, the one being looked after. Laura wrote her gently, even lovingly, but she wrote her small, because that is how Laura had experienced her, and because a memoir is the memoirist's story. And in Laura's story, Carrie was never going to be the lead. So Carrie got to watch, in real time, the exact thing this whole night has been about: the family being turned into myth, and herself being quietly fixed in the margins of it. Not erased, that's too strong, and it isn't fair to Laura, who loved her sisters and was telling the truth as she had lived it. But set in print for all time as the background sister. The version of Carrie the world would remember was being decided, page by beautiful page, by the one sister who would outlive her. There is no villainy in it, which is exactly why it is so hard to argue with. Laura was not stealing anything from Carrie. She was writing what was true to her own experience, in her own voice, about her own childhood, and she did it so well that it became everyone's childhood. But truth told from one chair in the room is still only the view from that chair. From Laura's chair, Carrie was the little sister at the edge of the frame. There was no malice in seeing her that way. There was only the ordinary fact that the person holding the pen always sits at the centre of the story, and everyone else, however much they did, becomes scenery. And Carrie, by every indication, simply accepted it, the way she had accepted coming second her whole life. There is no record of her complaining, no bitter letter, no demand for her due, no insistence that she had set type and held land and buried them all. If she felt the strangeness of becoming a minor character in the most famous version of her own life, she kept it to herself, the way she had kept everything to herself since she was a girl learning to need less so that Mary could have more. And that, in the end, is the deepest reason Carrie disappeared. Not because Laura was unkind, because Carrie never once stood up and insisted on being seen, not in the family, not in the books, not in history. She did the work and let the others have the story. She was doing it even now, an old woman in a mining town in the 1940s, reading her own beloved childhood and finding herself, politely and permanently, in the background of it. The books would make the Ingalls name eternal. They would also, without ever meaning to, write the final word on Carrie, the little one, the frail one, the one you don't quite remember. She had only a few years left to be even that. The years after Mary died were the quietest Carrie ever had, and quiet, for a woman whose whole life had been spent being needed, is its own kind of grief. But Carrie was not, in these last years, without an anchor of her own. She had something that had been hers since she was 22 years old, something the books never mentioned and the show never knew. She had the Order of the Eastern Star. Carrie had been a charter member of the De Smet chapter of the Order of the Eastern Star in 1892, when she was 22. The Eastern Star is the women's affiliate body of Freemasonry, open to both men and women, but tied to master masons, founded on a set of biblical heroines and a 5-pointed star. Carrie's father had joined the De Smet Masonic Lodge in 1885. In 1893, the year the local Eastern Star chapter was organised, Charles and his daughters Carrie and Laura all joined together. The fraternal world was, for the Ingallses, a family affair. When Carrie moved to Keystone in 1911, she transferred her Eastern Star membership to the Keystone chapter. For the next 54 years, that membership was one of the few constants in a life otherwise made of moves and losses. She held it through the marriage, through the homestead, through Mary's death, and David's death, and Grace's death. She held it through the years alone in the house under the mountain. She held it, in fact, until the very end of her life. In April of 1946, 2 months before her own death, Carrie was awarded her 50-year membership pin in the Order of the Eastern Star. 50 years. A half-century of belonging to the same organisation, in the same town, on the same mountain. She had joined as a young woman of 22 with bad lungs and a fresh teaching certificate and no husband in sight. She received the pin as an old woman of 75, a widow, the keeper of more graves than living relatives, the last of her family in the Black Hills. There is no photograph of the moment that anyone has found. The record gives us only the fact itself. In April of 1946, Carrie Ingalls Swanzey received her 50-year pin, and then, 8 weeks later, she was gone. Hold that pin in your mind. It is the closest thing Carrie's life has to a public recognition. A small gold star, presented by an organisation most people have never heard of, in a small mining town most people cannot find on a map, to a woman the world had decided was a minor character in someone else's story. She had outlived her father by 44 years, her mother by 22, her sister Mary by 18, her husband by 8, her stepson by 7, her sister Grace by 5. She had set type and held land and raised children and tended the dying, and the only public acknowledgement she ever received was a pin for showing up to the same meetings for 50 years. And there is one more thing she did in these last years that deserves to be set down properly, because the original version of this story got it slightly wrong. Carrie never let go of the homestead. That quarter section out by Philip, the one she had proved up alone back in 1908. She kept it, all through the marriage, all through the Keystone decades, all through the widowhood. It stayed in her name to the end, the single piece of the world that bore her signature and no one else's. When at last she let it go, she gave it not to family. There was no family left to give it to, and not, as a careless telling might have it, to her lodge in some vague sense. She gave it specifically to the Masons of Keystone, to be sold so they could build a Masonic lodge in the town. The bequest fulfilled 2 lifelong commitments at once, to her late husband David, who had been a Freemason, and to her own half-century in the Eastern Star, the women's body of the same fraternity. The Masonic Lodge building in Keystone stands, in part, because of Carrie Ingalls. It is the only piece of physical infrastructure in the world that exists because of her. One final quiet act of a woman who had spent her entire life giving things away. She was an old woman in a quiet house under a finished mountain, the keeper of a family almost entirely in the ground, her own health at last beginning to fail in earnest. The body that had been told 8 decades before that it would not last had outlasted nearly everything and nearly everyone who ever doubted it. There is a particular cruelty in the way she finally began to fail, because it was the same disease that had taken her baby sister, diabetes, the same shadow that ran through these sisters' blood, the same illness that had killed Grace in 1941 was now working on Carrie. And here we have to be honest, because the easy version of this story, the version that says insulin came too late for the Ingalls sisters, is not quite the true version. Insulin was discovered in 1921 by Banting and Best at the University of Toronto. The first human patient, a 14-year-old boy named Leonard Thompson, received an injection on January 11th, 1922. By 1923, insulin was commercially available in the United States. So when Grace died in 1941 and Carrie in 1946, insulin had been available for nearly 2 decades. It did not save them. The harder truth is that insulin was, and is, most effective for type 1 diabetes, the childhood onset form in which the body stops producing insulin entirely. The Ingalls sisters, diagnosed later in life, almost certainly had what we now call type 2 diabetes, a different disease in which the body becomes resistant to insulin. Insulin helps, but it does not cure. And in rural South Dakota in the 1930s and 1940s, access to consistent medical care, regular blood sugar monitoring, and the dietary discipline that adult-onset diabetes demands was limited. Even with insulin, long-term diabetic complications, kidney failure, heart disease, infection, stroke, remained common causes of death through the 1940s. The Ingalls sisters had survived locusts and blizzards and starvation, and the deaths of nearly everyone they loved. What finally took Grace, and then Carrie, was a quiet disease in the blood, in the years just after medicine had learned to fight it, and not well enough. The body that had been failing Carrie Ingalls since she was a child held on, in the end, for 75 years. That number deserves a moment by itself. 75. In an era when the average American woman did not reach 60, the frailest of the Ingalls daughters, the one the family braced to lose at 10, the one the long winter nearly took, the one who had spent her whole life chasing air that wouldn't close her throat, outlasted not only her own poor odds, but most of the strong, healthy people who had quietly counted her out. It was diabetes that finally did it, the same illness that had taken Grace, the same shadow that ran through these sisters' blood. On the 2nd of June, 1946, a Sunday, Carrie Ingalls Swanzey died. Not as a careless telling might have it in Keystone. She died at the Black Hills General Hospital in Rapid City, South Dakota, the nearest real medical facility to the mining town she had called home for 35 years. She was 75 years old, 8 weeks past the Eastern Star Pin, 11 years past the last of her books, the keeper of more graves than any other member of her family. Her body was brought back to Keystone, and on a Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, an Order of Eastern Star funeral was held for her at the Keystone Congregational Church. The Eastern Star conducted the rites. A reverend named Holmes, his first name does not survive in the clipping, officiated. It was the funeral of a 50-year member, held in the town where she had been a member for 35 of those years, attended by the few remaining people in Keystone who knew her as anything other than the quiet widow on the hill. There is no famous account of her last hours, no book chapter, no deathbed scene that millions of readers can picture. She died the way she had mostly lived, quietly, off to the side of the story, attended by the family she had made rather than the one she had been born into in a town most people couldn't find on a map. The world that had built an industry out of her childhood did not, on the whole, notice that the last of the Ingalls daughters but one had gone. They brought her home to De Smet. That's the detail to hold, because it's the closest thing this story has to a moment of grace. After a life spent moving, Kansas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Dakota, Colorado, the Black Hills, a lifetime of wagons and trains and shanties, and the endless search for somewhere she could breathe, Carrie came to rest in the one place that had ever really been home, the De Smet Cemetery, the family plot. They laid her down beside the people she had spent her life helping and, in the end, burying, beside Pa, beside Ma, beside Mary, beside Grace, beside the baby brother Freddie had never made it back to join. He's still in South Troy, Minnesota, in an unmarked grave somewhere along the route. But beside every other Ingalls who had drawn breath in that prairie town, the row is still there. You can go and see it. Charles and Caroline and their daughters gathered around them, the whole famous family brought back together at last under the prairie sky, in the ground, in the town where the books finally stopped moving them around. And there, in that row of stones, the unfairness of Carrie's whole life quietly completes itself. Because the visitors come, and they do come from all over the world, to stand at the graves of the Little House family. They know those names. They have read those names. Carrie's stone sits right there among them, the same size, the same prairie weather on it. And most of the people standing in that cemetery could not tell you a single thing about the woman beneath it. She is buried in the most visited family plot in American frontier memory. And she is, even there, even now, the one nobody came to see. Go to De Smet in the summer and you will find them. The visitors, with their well-worn copies of the books, walking the cemetery and the old town site, standing at the graves with something like reverence. They came because a childhood in these pages meant something to them, and that is a beautiful thing, and none of it is wrong. But watch where they stand. They find Pa, they find Ma. They linger at Laura's people, and Carrie's stone, the same grey granite, weathered by the same wind, holds them for a moment and then lets them move on, because the name does not catch on anything they were told to remember. She lies at the centre of the thing everyone came to see, and remains, even in death, the part of it they were never taught to look for. There is only one piece of honesty to add here, and it matters because this story does not need exaggeration to land. Carrie was not, in the very end, the last of them. There was still Laura, the famous one, down in Missouri, who would outlive Carrie by another 11 years and die on the 10th of February 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday, in her sleep at her Rocky Ridge farm in Mansfield, Missouri. So this is not the tidy tale of the runt who outlast every single one. It is something quieter and truer. Carrie outlived nearly all of them, and the one sister who outlived her was the one who would also get to decide in print how the whole family would be remembered. Sit with that pairing, because it is the engine of everything unfair about Carrie's place in history. The sister who did the actual, physical, unglamorous work of holding the family together at the end, taking Mary in, sitting with the dying, keeping the home, tending the graves, was Carrie. The sister who would tell the world what the family had been, who would choose what got remembered and what got smoothed away, was Laura. One of them lived the duty, the other one held the pen, and the one with the pen, for all her genius and all her love, did not give the one with the duty very much of the page. This is not an accusation against Laura. It is closer to a law of how memory works. The people who get remembered are, overwhelmingly, the people who make something that outlasts them. A book, a fortune, a monument, a name attached to an event. The people who get forgotten are the ones whose great work was other people, keeping them fed, keeping them company, keeping them alive. That work vanishes the moment it is finished, because it leaves nothing behind but the people it was spent on, and those people move on, and then they too are gone. Carrie's life's work was her family, and a family, unlike a book, does not stay on a shelf where strangers can find it 100 years later. Step back from Carrie for a moment and look at the whole row of them, because the shape of it says something this family never said out loud. Charles and Caroline Ingalls raised 4 daughters to adulthood: Mary, Laura, Carrie, Grace, after losing their only son in infancy. 4 girls who survived the dugout and the grasshoppers and the long winter and all the cold miles between. 4 girls the whole world would eventually come to know, or think it knew. Now follow each of them to the end. Mary, the eldest, the golden one, blind from 14, never married, never independent, dependent on her mother, and then her sisters for 50 years, dead at 63 in Carrie's spare room. Grace, the youngest, a farmer's wife in a small town a few miles from where she was born, no children, dead at 64 of the same disease that was waiting for Carrie. Carrie herself, the one we followed all night, married late, no children of her own body, the keeper of the others, and Laura, the famous one. Laura married Almanzo, and they had their own hard road. A son who died in infancy, a house that burned, years of debt and failed crops, a diphtheria that left Almanzo partly crippled for life. They had one child who lived, a daughter, Rose, born in 1886. But here is the thing that the 4 endings add up to, the thing that should stop you. Not one of them left a living line. Mary, no children. Grace, no children. Carrie, no children of her own. And Laura's only surviving child, Rose Wilder Lane, married, and in 1909 in San Francisco gave birth to a stillborn son, the only child she ever carried. She had no surviving children. When Rose died on the 30th of October, 1968, in Danbury, Connecticut, at the age of 81, the direct line of Charles and Caroline Ingalls, the most famous pioneer family in the American imagination, the family 100 million people feel they grew up inside, simply ended. There are no Ingalls grandchildren walking round, no great-grandchildren who carry that blood. The family that stands, in our memory, for the whole idea of putting down roots and raising the next generation on new land left, in the end, no descendants at all. It's the quietest tragedy in the whole story, and it's one Carrie lived inside without ever, as far as we know, remarking on it. She buried the sister who couldn't see, and the baby sister who couldn't carry a child, and watched from a distance the famous sister's only grandchild hope come to nothing. She was herself part of the ending, the childless caretaker, the branch that stopped. And maybe that's the deepest reason the work she did vanished. There were no children of hers to remember her. In that era, childlessness for a woman was treated as a kind of erasure in advance. The line that stops, the name that ends, the person with no one obligated to carry her forward. It was spoken of, when it was spoken of at all, as a misfortune or a failure, rarely as a simple fact of a life that was full of other things. Carrie absorbed that too, the way she absorbed everything without protest. She poured her mothering into another woman's children, and her care into a blind sister, and her labour into towns full of strangers, and left behind no one whose job it would be to remember her, which is exactly the kind of life the record is built to lose. No grandchildren to tell the story, to keep the photograph on the mantel, to drive out to the cemetery and say, "That one, that small stone, that was my grandmother Carrie, and let me tell you what she did." The people who keep our memory alive are usually the people we raise. Carrie raised two, her stepchildren, Harold and Mary Swanzey, and loved them, and they her. Harold died in 1939, childless at 32. Mary Swanzey lived on, but the Ingalls memory passed down a different channel, through Laura's books, and in that channel Carrie was always going to be the little one in the background. Here is how you disappear, even when your life is extraordinary. You don't disappear by doing too little. Carrie did plenty. You disappear by doing the kind of things nobody writes down, the helping, the managing, the staying, the quiet, unglamorous, load-bearing work that holds a family up and leaves no story behind it. Because stories are made of conflict and adventure and choice, and duty does not photograph well. Carrie Ingalls was left out of history in 3 different ways, and it's worth naming all 3 because together they explain the whole silence. The first way was the books. Laura wrote the family into immortality, and Laura, telling the story of her own childhood, naturally put herself and Mary at the centre of it. Mary, the good older sister, Laura, the wild younger one, the two of them the engine of nearly every scene. Carrie, younger and sicklier and quieter, became what younger, quiet siblings so often become in someone else's memoir. A name, a presence, a little sister in the background of the important moments. Laura didn't erase Carrie out of malice. She simply wrote the story she had lived, and in the story Laura lived, Carrie was a supporting character. The trouble is that Laura's version became the only version most people would ever read. The second way was the television show. When the cameras came in the 1970s, they took even the little the books had given her and made it less. On screen, Carrie was a perpetual toddler. The small one who stumbles and falls in the long grass of the opening credits, which is the moment most people actually remember her by. A child tumbling in a field, frozen there forever, never allowed to grow into the woman who set type and held land and buried her sisters. That single image may have done more to fix Carrie in the public mind than anything in the books. And it is a toddler falling down. An entire generation knows Carrie Ingalls as a little girl losing her footing in tall grass, and knows nothing else, because nothing else was ever shown to them. The woman who clerked and set type, and proved a homestead, and nursed a blind sister to her death does not exist on that screen. She was edited down to her smallest, most helpless second and looped forever. If you wanted to design a way to erase a capable woman while seeming to celebrate her family, you could hardly do better than to freeze her, permanently, at the age of 3. The show didn't lie about Carrie so much as it shrank her, the way the books had, only more so. And the third way was Carrie herself. She left us almost nothing. No memoir, no published letters to speak of, no campaign to be remembered. The other sisters' lives reached us partly because they, or the people around them, wrote things down. Carrie mostly didn't, or what she wrote didn't survive, and so the one voice that could have told us what it actually felt like to be the overlooked Ingalls is the one voice the record doesn't have. Her silence in history is, in a way, the final echo of her silence in the family. She was the one who didn't take up space. She kept not taking it up, right to the end, and past it. And here is the thing worth saying out loud, because it reaches past Carrie and touches almost everyone who has ever lived. Carrie Ingalls is not really an unusual story. She is an unusually visible one. For every name we remember from the frontier, every Laura, every Pa, every face on a book cover or carved into a mountain, there were 100 Carries. The ones who did the daily, unglamorous, load-bearing work of keeping people alive and households running, and the dying company. The ones who never wrote a book, never made a claim on history, never insisted on being the point of anything. They held the whole thing up, and then the record closed over them without a ripple, because the record is made of conflict and achievement and noise, and what they did was quiet. Carrie is simply one we can still see, and only because she happened to stand her whole life next to the brightest light American frontier memory ever produced. Step her 1 inch to the side away from the famous sister, and she would be gone entirely, like the 100 others. If you have ever been the one who held things together and watched someone else be remembered for it, the one who was useful to people who never quite saw you, then you already understand Carrie Ingalls better than the books ever let on. So we are left to do for Carrie the thing nobody did while it would have meant something to her. To look at the whole life at once and say plainly what it was. She was born in the cabin the world named a book after, and got none of the fame. She nearly died at 10 in the winter that made the others legends, and got none of the credit, only the lifelong cough. She earned a teacher's certificate and a printer's trade in an age that gave women neither easily. She held a piece of the Prairie alone when holding it. A loan was nearly unheard of for a woman, paying $14 to open the file and $80 to close it, and she held that land for 38 years, until she gave it away to the fraternity her father had joined. She married late and raised 2 children who weren't hers, and loved them as if they were, and buried one of them, the one who carved the mountain when he was 32. She received a 50-year pin from an organization most people have never heard of 2 months before she died, and when the family that had always come first finally needed someone to take in its blind, helpless, beloved Mary and sit with her to the end, it was Carrie's door that opened and Carrie's house where Mary died. The family braced for 75 years to lose Carrie first. Instead, Carrie was the one who carried them out, one by one. Pa, Ma, Mary, Grace, her husband, her stepson. The frail sister buried the strong ones, kept the home, tended the graves, and asked for nothing. And history, taking her at exactly the value the family always had, wrote her down as the little one who fell in the grass. You came tonight, maybe, thinking you knew this family, the cabin, the fiddle, the blind sister and the girl who became a writer. You knew the parts that made the books. Now you know the part that didn't. There were 4 Ingalls daughters. The one the world remembers least is the one who was there for the most. At the very beginning, in the cabin on the Osage Diminished Reserve, in the winter that nearly took her, in the print shop and the homestead shanty and the house under the mountain, and at every ending after in the rooms where the famous family quietly came apart. They built a monument to the childhood, 8 books, a television show, a granite mountain with 4 faces on it, carved in part by a man she raised. They never built one to the woman who stayed to the end of it. The Prairie keeps her now. In a row of stones people travel across the world to visit and walk straight past. She would not have minded. That in the end is the whole tragedy of Carrie Ingalls. She never once expected to be seen.